have two screens here. Okay, so this is the second time I'm giving this talk. So it's on security versus access. So I started out in information security, and during my undergraduate degree, I focused on policies and how they increase the security of companies. So I was very much on the side of tie down access, make sure everything's secure. And I didn't really look at it from the other point of view. But since then, I've been working as a software engineer. The people who, among other engineers, need very high access to be able to do their job. So I can see it from both sides of view now. So I thought I'd be a good person to do a devil's advocate talk discussing both. So here we are. So what are access controls? And I'm going to talk about how they hinder employee access. So access controls, sorry, it's difficult when you don't have an audience in front of you, isn't it? Sorry, so access controls are measures put in place to increase a organization's security posture. They can be both beneficial and detrimental to an organization because they need to be implemented in a way that doesn't affect team cohesion or cause a toxic culture of mistrust. So they can also hinder employees from being able to complete the day-to-day activities. So if security access aren't balanced, it creates quite a few issues and delays. So to look at it, we should look at the CIA triad. So this is probably something that's very new to people who have a coding background. They might not have even heard of it. When you think of CIA, you don't think of this. But the CIA triad stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So this is, whenever anyone starts to learn about security, this is where you start. So they all need to be balanced. That's why it's a triad for security to be implemented properly. And this depends on company to company how this should be balanced. So it isn't like three equals. So an organization should work out something called a risk appetite. So this is how they decide how much protection they need for their assets and how much money they should spend protecting it. So, for example, you could look at a risk management system. So a lot of people, when they plan disaster recovery, they'd plan for maybe an hour or two power cut, but not many companies planned for a worldwide pandemic. So, you know, it wouldn't have been worth it. Well, it would have, looking back, but it was so unlikely that people didn't plan for it. So that's something, when you go to it, it would be proactive. It would be reactive rather than proactive, sorry. So another method would be to add automated access. So this is implemented in a lot of companies where you've got software such as Novell ZenWorks, where you can go to it and download pre-authorized software. A lot of computers will come with all the software you already need to do your job on them. But from a software engineer's point of view, where you're trying out new tools and frameworks quite often, that isn't always the case. So the last one is mutual trust. Sorry. Yeah, so the last one's mutual trust. So the issue with monitoring everything is that it makes an employee feel like they're being watched. And when that happens, it makes them feel like they're not trusted. So you need to trust them enough for them to do their job and trust that they'll not breach security, but they also need to trust you. They need to trust you that you aren't trying to make their job too difficult just for the sake of it. So that there needs to be a communication there. So from a security person's point of view, they need to let people who, they need to let their workers know what access they can have and what access they need to ask for and why that is. And then from the other point of view, a developer needs to request access rather than trying to grant themselves it, which you'd like to think doesn't happen often, but it is something that happens. So one thing you can put in place is policy-based controls. So this is where trust is definitely needed, because it means that people aren't stopped from doing things. So an information security management system is what would be used to do this, and it would be a set of policy documents, including the ones on the screen, so acceptable use, change control, and patch management. So this is telling people what they should do and how they should do it and what they can't do. So this works quite well with small companies when you can monitor people and get to know people to know that you can trust them on a one-to-one basis. But as companies get larger, it becomes problematic because you can't trust everybody. So then on the other side, you've got enforced controls, such as blacklisting, multi-factor authentication, principal of least privilege, and active versus static controls. So these are set by the organization to stop people doing things. So you try to download something from the internet, that is you try to install a piece of software. You can download it from the internet, probably. Sometimes they block downloading, but then you need admin privileges to be able to install it. So this is when things like Novell ZenWorks is used, because it lists everything that's allowed. But when you're a developer, you need many more applications. So this would blacklist certain things, so you know what you can't have, but then for anything in the middle you'd have to, so you got blacklisting and whitelisting, so you know what you can definitely have, you know what you can't definitely have, and then anything in the middle you have to ask if whether you can have it or not, or request it through a service desk ticket. So I put MFA in here because it's a level of control where you can't get in without enforced control. So it doesn't really fit in, but when talking to a security group, it did fit in nicely, but I'll skip that one. So principal of least privilege. So a lot of developers don't like this, and it's created some massive hoo-has on Twitter if you discuss it. So principal of least privilege is when you're only given the set access that you need to do your job. The issue is these set accesses may change, so you need to request more access if anything's in your way, and then you need a quick turnaround to be able to do it. So this helps security because it stops something. Because if your account became compromised, it means that a malicious actor wouldn't have access to admin privileges on your machine, for example. So it would be another barrier in place. And then you've got active versus static controls. So active versus static controls are an interesting one, because active controls are I'm sorry. I'm going to skip on to the next one just because I've had a brain fart, but I'll come back to this one. I'll remember to. So this is an interesting one. So kids using proxies to bypass school control accounts. So I remember this when I was in school. It was a massive thing. And so we'd want to go on Facebook when we were in school. So we would have a proxy URL we'd go to. It would change each week, the one that works, because the school would block them every week. But the schools didn't used to teach online etiquette. They didn't teach what we couldn't do. They didn't give us a policy, so we didn't realize we were doing anything wrong. Yes, they were blacklisting it, but they didn't explain why. So we just kept going to different proxy every week, and we would use it to go onto Facebook. So if kids are getting around that, and I know some friends who managed to gain access to gain a bit too much access to their school system through command prompt. So it's definitely an issue. And if kids are doing that at 13, 14, 15, then just imagine what skilled engineers can do. So that's why the trust needs to be there, to make sure that the engineers aren't hacking their way to get the access they need, because they're not getting the access quick enough. So it is all a balance act. So that's when personal ethics versus risk of reprimand come in. So personally, for me, I've got a very strong set of personal ethics, and it's why I like security so much, is that I do think that caring about the security of a company makes you a good employee, because at the end of the day, keeping a company secure is keeping yourself in a job, because if the company gets attacked, then that puts it at risk to all sorts of things. So some people understand the personal ethical side of it, and they keep themselves in line because of that. So they adhere to the policies that are written, and they make sure they do everything they can to keep the company secure. But then there are some people who only stay in line because of risk of reprimand. So they're the people who we need to have need to have enforced controls to control, such as blacklisting, because they need something in place to stop them doing the wrong thing, or monitoring, because then if they do something wrong, it'll be flagged up, and if they know the monitor is in place, they probably won't do something wrong, because they won't want to lose their job. So it's definitely a balancing act between them as well. Sorry, I keep saying balancing act. So that's when disgruntled employees come into it, because somebody who has a strong personal ethics can actually go the other way when they're treated badly in a company, or when they don't have the access they need to do the job. Because imagine your manager above you is getting annoyed at you for not getting your work done in time, but then the reason you're not being able to get your work done is because you don't have the access you need to do your job. So that's someone from security stopping you being able to do your job, but then your manager wants you to get everything done quickly. Someone else on your team might be hacking their way to be able to do the job, but you have good personal ethics, so you don't do that. So then you might become disgruntled against the company in that way, and then either become a malicious actor and actually try to get kind of revenge in worst case scenario, or ask your mate how they're hacking their way to do their job and do the same thing. So that's what companies don't want to have. Employees need the access to do their job, so that doesn't happen. But I hope that's like worst case scenario. I don't think that happens too often. So why do we secure things if it makes people's jobs difficult? Well, security first is my belief and many other people's belief, because even though I like to have the access to do my job, I also like having a job, and keeping companies and organizations safe should be the first priority. And then you might trust your employees, but you need to keep your company secure, and you might even be going for a tender that you need a certain certification to get. So you'll need certain security implementations in place in order to get those certifications. That's when communication comes in, and it's key. just communicate with employees saying these are the things in place and this is why they're in place. And then that mutual understanding will really help the company culture, because they'll understand why those access controls are in place. So the next one is you don't trust some. So as a company gets larger, and even smaller companies, you might not be able to trust everyone. So that's when the harder access controls need to be in place. You need to stop the people who might be malicious. And when companies are really, really large, you can't really know on a personal level people. So you need to just put these enforcements in place for everyone. So sole traders might want to get a tender that requires them to have good security. They might realise that their whole livelihood depends on their company. So securing their customer information, GDPR can cost you a lot if you lose customer information. Securing your own GitHub down, you could lose access to your whole SaaS product, or other people could get access to it, or GitHub or Bitbucket or GitLab. And finally, you might be going for a tender that requires you to have certain levels of certification. So you'd need to put these things in place. At the end of the day, it's only going to benefit a person, because the difference between a sole trader and a company is that the IT service desk is you. If you need to grant yourself access or escalate your privilege to do a job, you can do it, but you just have to document it and make sure it's done correctly. Another one is any security certification increases customer trust. So like a company with ISO 27001 or any other certification is going to show, yes, we're a secure organization. Yes, you can trust us to keep your data safe. So that's the benefit. And the more trust, the more money. So that's the reason why it's worth being secure. And then this is a difficult one to say, because it was so I first gave this talk at B-Sides Cymru in 2019, and then I gave it again in B-Sides Cymru and end of last year. And I put a quote from Torchwood in the first one. So I'm just going to say 21st century is when everything changes and you've got to be ready. So yeah, because during lockdown, cybercrime has gone up and companies really need to lock everything down. So I know this is more of a coding group, and I know it's more of a security talk, but I thought maybe it would help a lot of the coders see it from the security point of view. And I'm really sorry that I've been so bad at talking. Actually, it's more difficult to get back into it than you think, than I thought. Yeah, and this was nowhere near as long as I thought it'd be, so I'm sorry, Jonathan. So yeah. Ooh.
No problem. We've got so many questions for you, so we'll keep you forever.
I thought this had been awful. Any questions?
Oh, lots of questions. Yeah.
So I'll start with Raluca's one actually first, which is, what advice would you give to someone who's interested in building a career in security?
So there are so many areas of security, like technical and non-technical. So I originally wanted to go into compliance. I was very interested in policy writing. I would say for anything, so technical or non-technical, definitely personal projects. So if you want to go into technical, I'll start with non-technical. If you want to go into the non-technical, like compliance, my first dissertation was on creating a policy document for SCADA systems, so they're supervisory control and data acquisition systems. I know it sounds more complicated than it is. If you imagine the national grid, or any company's national grid. It's the best example, in my opinion. So that's the system in the country that controls the electrics. So that's a whole system of electronics that take in data, read the data, and react to the data. So very, very basic version will be a thermostat. So if you want it to be 20 degrees C, it takes in the temperature. If it's under 20 degrees C, it turns the boiler on. If it's over 20 degrees C, it turns it off. Sorry, I'm completely going off the point. But so I researched all the different policy documents that were out there. Universities have really good policy documents, security policy documents. So I researched quite a few of them. I went through ISO 27001, anything out there, and I wrote a literature review on each of the policy documents, and then created a very large policy document based on all of them, specifically for SCADA systems. So even though that was for university, if somebody wanted to get into a policy-based job, they could do a little project similar to that and have it as kind of like similar to having a GitHub portfolio. You could have a policy portfolio where you showed your skills, your understanding of policy documents. So that's, I know everyone always talks about how to get into the technical side, but personal projects are the way into the non-technical side too. So on the technical side, for things like penetration testing, there's a company in Bristol called Immersive Labs, and I really like their labs, and they're really good if you want to learn penetration testing. So I would suggest getting started on their labs. I haven't done as many of them as I'd want to. And then there's Hack the Box as well. That's fun. I really haven't done many of them either. I've spent more time coding than hacking much recently. There are tons of jobs in cyber, and they're all like different. Then you've got security engineer. So that's a great way to get into security, is actually to learn to code, but it's not the only way into security, because I hate it when people say you need to know how to code to get into security. So if you learn to code and then know a bit about security, that's a great way to get in. Yeah, I think I went way overboard on that answer.
That's a good answer, thank you. So in the beginning of your talk, you talked about trusting your employees, but often like we work with third parties, right? Like we might get a freelancer in and we need them to be able to do a job, right? So how do you build that trust so you can give access, and then how would you handle giving access to external parties?
Good question. I think that's when a lot of documents would come into place. So if you have a personal relationship with them and you trust them, then you could go off gut instinct. However, having contracts and an NDA in place would be the best way to protect a company from third party.
Cool. And Magnus had a good question about how do you feel about passwords? Do you prefer them over alternatives such as magic links?
I think the passwords will, don't quote me on this, actually, I don't know. I think passwords will always have a place somewhere. I think they're becoming less and less. I do personally really like magic links. However, someone gains access to your email and there isn't an MFA on it, then it's a problem. I like magic links if there's also multi-factor authentication and you need to use a code on your phone as well, or an authentication app. I don't like them on their own. I think I would actually prefer passwords to them.
Cool. Well, we have been having that debate internally, actually. How do you handle a use case where someone needs urgent access to a system, just like when Facebook went down and and their DNS because they're DNS servers, and they couldn't actually access their servers because there was so much security. Like, how do you handle that like level of urgent access requirement?
So I would hope that a company would have a like access, like a disaster recovery plan. However, I know a lot of companies wouldn't have that. If something's urgent and it's going to cost the company a lot of money, then usually the decision will be made quite high up to forego usual access controls and authorizations, and one person will take responsibility for that decision, and then the access is just granted. But it also depends on the risk appetite of the company, whether they can wait a bit longer to get it done properly or whether it needs to be done immediately. Usually, I can't remember the name of the policy, but usually there's a policy that in large companies that outlines what you can do in an emergency situation and who calls the shots. It's more difficult when you don't have anyone senior. Like if it's the middle of the night, if there's no one senior you can get in touch with, one person will have to take the form. So then it would be a personal decision. It's a really difficult scenario to give one answer on, and it would depend on a company's risk appetite.
Sure. What so Mark had the question. I know you're playing devil's advocate, but should the employers ever trust an employee with a significant threat is presented by insiders who may go rogue or become disaffected?
Can you say that again?
So I was reading someone else's question. I know you're playing devil's advocate, but should employers ever trust an employee when there is a significant threat presented by insiders?
No, that's when zero trust should be in place, personally. I know a lot of people would disagree with that. But if there is a significant threat, it depends how big that threat is to the company. If it was very significant and it could cause a massive outage, then there should be a lot of access controls in place and a lot of monitoring and a lot of logs, and it should be zero trust. But I know a lot of people won't like that opinion.
Yeah, I like trusting people. Do you have any particular interesting security stories that you found interesting? Like anything you experienced since like entering the workforce, right? And that is interesting. Like, oh, this place I worked at, this happened.
I'm going to do myself a favour and not answer that out of respect to my employers. I don't really show where I used to work online, but I also no, I'd prefer not to discuss any personal stories. Yeah, sorry.
Sure. Other than reputation, is there a way for a company to trust a white hat hacker when they wish to hire them to enhance their internal security?
Well, white hat hackers are usually not malicious at all. Scope documents, contracts, NDAs, a lot of things signed to protect the company. Having a scope in place is the big one. And also a monitoring system that will actually monitor what the ethical hackers is doing as a pen tester. Usually normal monitoring systems would pick that up, but white hat hackers are still are still hackers, so they would know how to evade those. So I would say to put something in the contract that says not to evade any. Oh, that's difficult. You want them to do it so they're on the radar, but you also want them to be able to show to you that they can do it off the radar. I think for the white hat, it's mainly about them having a good history of being trustworthy. So for starters, if this is being asked by a white hat, for starters, work with, if you know people at companies, work with people you know and trust, and then they can give good references for you to companies that you want to work with in the future. From the other point of view, from the company's point of view, contracts, NDA, scope, it's just important to have the documents in place.
Cool. And I'll make this last one for you. So where do you think the biggest area of security risk is for a company?
Depends on the company. I think statistics say that the biggest risk is the insider risk. So I think I'd go for that, because the insider risk isn't only disgruntled employees, it's also employees that don't realize they're doing anything wrong. So I would go with the insider risk, yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much for your talk.
That's all right.
I enjoyed it. And yeah, thank you very much.
That's all right. Sorry it was so rusty, but thank you for the good questions.
It was very informative for me personally, because I know next to nothing about security other than the standard interview questions like, oh, what is cross-site scripting, what is CORS, etc., etc. But it's definitely like shed light, at least for me particularly. Like I had no idea how people get into security. Like, is it like people fall into security? Do they actively pursue that path? Or yeah, so thank you so much. Right, that was Jenny Codes, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just gonna share my screen just to say a final thank you to, 1 second, there we go. Oh, Zoom. Okay. Right, okay, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen. So thank you very much, Jenny, for taking the time tonight and being our guest speaker. It was certainly very, very nice to hear from someone working in security. Thank you also to our sponsor, RVU. You can always tweet at RVU Engineers. We're always happy to reply. So, and if you know anyone who might be interested in becoming a guest speaker for Programmed in Pencil, please drop us a line. And I think this is the official ending of our meeting. Jonathan.